Good morning. Welcome back to the Virtual Transplant Journey 2022. We're excited to recognize our sponsors who have made this event possible. Please give your attention to this short video provided by Trio International.
On behalf of Trio National, congratulations, Michelle and Marty Marin and your Trio Maryland chapter for putting together this fantastic conference adapted for the restrictions of pandemic year past. Great work. Anybody else would like to join Trio in making things like this happen? Go to our website at trioweb.org and sign up. You can make a big world of difference, just like Trio Maryland is with that kind of leadership.
Please remember that you can post your questions in the Q&A tab, and we will share with the speaker after the presentation as time allows. Christine Hare is a registered dietitian and certified renal specialist with over 20 years of experience. She has worked with transplant patients for 14 years and currently leads interactive Kidney Smart education classes in the community. Christine is a smart educator with DaVita Kidney Care, and we are pleased to have her here today to share pre- and post-transplant nutrition and diet, plus exercise recommendations. Welcome, Christine.
Thanks, Teresa. Welcome, everybody. I hope everyone's having a great conference so far. I'm going to share my screen. All right, well, let's get started. So yeah, as Teresa mentioned, today's talk, we're going to talk a little bit about nutrition and exercise just in your transplant journey, wherever you might be. So before we get started, I always like to know a little bit about who's here today. So Teresa's going to launch a quick poll to see, number one, have you already had a transplant? Are you waiting? So a poll is going to come up. So if you want to answer any of the questions, just so we can see who's here with us today. Awesome. So we've got a good mix. So I love seeing the numbers come through. It's always fascinating to me. So we've got a pretty good mix of waiting on a transplant versus having a transplant. Also some family members. So that is really cool to see. And then one more poll that Teresa's going to pull up is just which organ type. So you can see just those results. It's really interesting. And then Teresa, if you can pull up the other poll.
Sorry, there we go.
Oh, you're fine. I know sometimes the polls get a little wonky.
They do. There we go.
There we go. So let's hear, like, what kind of organ type? So are you liver, kidney, pancreas, heart, lung? I should have made I know sometimes there's even intestine transplant. So there can be both. But okay, so this is really cool to see. So definitely heavier on the kidney and liver, with a few hearts mixed in there. Love to see that. It's really nice to see where everyone is coming from. Awesome. So I'm so glad to hear a little bit about where everyone is coming from today, because I like to know my audience a little bit. Excellent. So we can see we've got the kidneys are leading the way with the livers close behind. All right. Let me see if I can close out of there. So nice to hear about you all. Just a little bit about myself. I don't know why my slides are not advancing. There we go. A little bit about me. Teresa already shared a little bit about my background. I am a certified renal specialist. I have a lot of experience working on a transplant team, as well as I'm more on the kidney side. I work with more pre-transplant patients and pre-dialysis patients is what I currently do. But I've been working in the transplant community for a long time. I love to travel. You'll probably hear it today. I'm originally from Western New York, so my accent sometimes comes out. I've been a fan of the Buffalo Bills before they were good. So just a little bit about me. So today's objectives, what I'm hoping you guys walk away with today is, number one, just learning more about the importance of nutrition throughout the whole transplant process. We'll talk a little bit about expectations pre-transplant for those of you that are still on the list, talking about the post-operative process, and also what to expect longer post-transplant. we'll talk about some of the nutrients that we maybe need to focus on or maybe need to be limited. And also just talk a little bit about exercise, because exercise definitely plays a huge role in this as well. Also, just some resources for at home and hopefully some time for questions as well. So, nutrition is something I've always been really passionate about. And I think a lot of times when we think about nutrition and diet, we think about weight loss, which a healthy weight is certainly a big part of a good, healthy lifestyle. However, in transplant or any kind of big operations, there's a lot about just getting adequate nutrition as well to really ensure post-operative healing. And this is a huge piece for you if you are maybe getting close to getting your transplant. It really does impact those outcomes immediately post-operatively. Because a transplant is a big operation. Those of you that have been through that, you know that. And proper nutrition really helps with the healing. Couple different pieces go into play there. A big part of it is adequate protein intake. Our bodies need that protein to build our muscles back up and to recover, to help with the actual wound closure. Also, blood sugar management. For those of you that have diabetes, that's really important because when our blood sugars are elevated, it is harder for wounds to close. And even if you don't have diabetes, sometimes just the stress of that whole surgical procedure can sometimes even elevate blood sugars in people that may not have been diabetic before. So getting those blood sugars controlled in the hospital and continuing to control them is really, really important. Also, electrolyte management, that's something immediately post-transplant in the hospital. Your doctors are monitoring your labs and adjusting different things to keep those levels stable. And then longer term, we'll talk about some of the things you may see. For longer term health, once you've had your transplant and we're out of the hospital and we're hopefully years and years after our transplant, we are looking at more things like just keeping a healthy weight, disease-specific management, whatever you are dealing with yourself, and again, keeping those levels of electrolytes stable. So pre-transplant, some different things that people typically will want to focus on. I really encourage people to think when you're on that transplant waiting list, how can I best prepare myself to be successful for the surgery? So we want to get ourselves kind of in that fighting condition. So optimizing that nutrition and functional status, really, really vital. As far as diet guidelines, everybody is different depending on which organ they're waiting for, what other health conditions they have. But one big piece that for most people in most organ types is a pretty similar thread is usually a lower sodium diet for most people is pretty indicated. So really working at watching that salt in your diet, maintaining appropriate protein. Pre-transplant, again, it depends a little bit on what your health conditions are. For people with kidney disease, if you're not on dialysis, typically a lower protein intake is the guidelines because protein actually does make our kidneys work harder. So for those that may be not on dialysis, we may be focusing on a lower protein intake to try to delay that progression of the kidney disease. If you are waiting for a kidney transplant and you're on dialysis, you probably know your protein needs are higher. That is something that the dietitians at dialysis will continually focus on making sure you're getting your protein in. Also with liver disease, oftentimes a protein intake a little bit more elevated is necessary too. So protein intake certainly is a big piece of this. And when I say protein, ideally it's many times protein that comes from anything from an animal. So chicken, beef, eggs, also your plant-based proteins like nuts and beans as well. Also just adjusting electrolytes as needed. For example, with kidney disease, some people may have to limit their potassium or their phosphorus intake. And then just trying to maintain a healthy weight. One of the big things going into any kind of surgery, being too underweight, sometimes if you're a little undernourished, it may be harder to heal. And also sometimes if you're a little bit overweight or obese, particularly sometimes if you carry some extra weight in your abdominal area, that's something that oftentimes they'll say, let's see if we can get that weight a little bit to a more ideal place, just because any extra weight sometimes can interfere with wound healing and delay that and have a higher risk of wound infections. And then staying active. Improved functional status, we really do see better recovery with that. This is tough because a lot of times with chronic diseases, you may not feel well enough to really exercise a lot. But just doing little things, anywhere you can get that movement and can be really good because the stronger you are going into a surgery, oftentimes the better that recovery process is. So really encourage you to work with your team. One of the nice things with the transplant community is that every hospital-based transplant unit does have a dietitian available to you. It may not be someone that you necessarily automatically meet with, but if you have questions about how can I be in a better place with my nutrition, or what can I do to maintain my health better, please reach out to your transplant team, whether it's pre or post-transplant, so that they can connect you with the dietitian if you're not already involved with them, to help you figure out what are the guidelines for you, because everybody truly is different. Another thing I really encourage is knowing what your goals are, or your numbers, if you will. I think it's such a wonderful idea if you can to get copies of your blood work, whether, or maybe if you look it up in your patient portal, but to kind of know, like, where do I want to be with this? An example I would use is for someone with diabetes to track your hemoglobin A1C levels, so you can see maybe how your blood sugar control is trending over time. For those of you that may have kidney disease, if you're pre-dialysis, it might be something like monitoring what your GFR is to see what your percent kidney function is. For anybody, like the potassium is a great number to know for either pre or post-transplant, to see if you need to adjust your nutrition intake. So knowing those goals is such a great thing. I know my patients used to always come with like binders of all their labs, which is such a great thing. Or nowadays, you can probably have it all in your laptop, but it definitely can be a great thing to know those numbers. And then optimizing that functional status. So what can I do to be stronger, particularly going into this transplant, and then maintaining that after? Along the lines of optimizing that functional status, particularly if you're getting into that pre-transplant process or post-transplant, and if you're really deconditioned, please don't be afraid to ask for help. Ask your primary care doctor or your transplant team for a referral for physical therapy. Physical therapists are the absolute experts on exercise and exercise with disease state. They can really look at where you are and give you ideas on what movements are good for you to do to strengthen your body. If you're already moving, but maybe you're looking to build that up a little bit, I personally am a huge fan of walking, because it's a mixture of that cardiovascular exercise as well as weight bearing. So you're getting your muscles a workout too. With that, depending where you are, again, everyone's baseline is different. A lot of times we hear, oh, try to walk 10,000 steps a day. That might not be where everyone will be. If you do have a step counter, whether it's a pedometer or on your phone or a Fitbit, what I encourage you to do is just track your steps on a normal day. See how many you get. Maybe you're already at 10,000. Maybe you're at 1,500. So wherever you are, just try to start gradually, bumping it up a little bit. If you're below that 10,000, see if you can, maybe say, okay, I'm going to go from 1,500 to, I don't know, I'll bump it up to 2,000. And gradually increase it. Typically, for most people, a goal of somewhere between 7,000 to 10,000 steps a day is a good place to be. Not everyone will get there, but I think the goal is just kind of seeing, can I increase it a little bit incrementally, can be a great thing to build that strength. If you don't have a step counter, not a problem at all. Focus more on the time. So maybe it might be a 10-minute walk, and gradually add about 5 to 10 minutes for a goal of about 150 to 300 minutes a week. And again, one thing I stress with exercise, it does not have to be all at one time. You don't necessarily have to walk for 30 minutes all at once. It might be a 5-minute walk 5 times a day, even whether it's around your living room, or if it's a beautiful day like today, hopefully get outside. Also, building those muscles up, resistance training, just really simple things like exercise bands can be excellent. And that's something that I know physical therapists will often teach you how to use. Light weights, chair exercises, but truly, it doesn't have to be lifting heavy weights. It can be really just modest weight, or even just your own strength as a resistance can be really good to build that strength going into a surgery. Because you really do see those post-operative outcomes improve. The other piece I think is really important is just kind of that exercise of our mind. Mindfulness does really matter, I find, for so many things. So whether it's meditation, yoga, Reiki, all can be really great things to aid in relaxation. Because let's face it, when we're going through health conditions, whether we're waiting for a transplant or have already had it, you can get really stressed out between just everything that you're going through. And one of the things I see a lot is the impact of when we're stressed, mental health, how it affects our physical health. Many people see when you're stressed, your blood pressure goes up. We don't want that. So engage in that mindfulness as well can be a really good thing for our overall health. So post-operative nutrition, I hit a little bit on this already, but really focusing on that lean protein intake. Protein's so important to help heal our bodies, partly for that actual surgical wound closure. The other thing that we see when we go through any kind of big medical procedure, your body's in what's called a catabolic state, which means breaking down. Muscle is being broken. We want to rebuild that. So we need more protein to help with that. So that's one thing I encourage, like if you are, if you have your transplant right after it, or even if you've already had it and you're kind of in that post-operative state, focus on getting protein first at your meals. Sometimes right after the transplant, especially when you're in the hospital, your appetite might not be 100%, but really try to make sure you're getting that protein in first for your meals. And if you're not loving the hospital food and you're not eating a lot, ask the staff if they have any kind of protein drinks. Most hospitals will have something like an Ensure or a Boost, just to make sure you're getting the adequate calories and protein that your body does need. Also managing blood sugars, if you're diabetic, super important to keep those blood sugars controlled to help with the healing. Also, many people after a transplant may be on a medication such as Prednisone, which is a steroid, which can affect blood sugars. So even for people that, again, I mentioned may not have had diabetes before, sometimes after a transplant, you may find that you are getting insulin in the hospital to help with that blood sugar control. And then just a consistent carbohydrate diet. So just anything that breaks down the sugar in our body, whether it's juices, sodas, cookies, cakes, to breads, pasta, long-term, just that consistency with it, and focusing more on limiting those simple sugars is really important. Electrolyte imbalances, just making sure watching those. Sometimes after a transplant, we do see a lot of times that magnesium and phosphorus may be low, so sometimes need to be replaced. And potassium can be variable. You'll see those levels kind of all over the place. So everyone's a little bit different in how their potassium might respond. Typically, you're still going to be on a lower sodium diet. And then hydration is very important as well. After a transplant, we typically want you to drink a good amount of water. This is something that can be a big change, particularly for people who maybe were on dialysis for kidney disease, or perhaps had congestive heart failure or heart issues where you were on a fluid restriction. That can be a big difference. We're going from limiting your fluid to taking in a lot more. And try to mainly choose those low caloric beverages. Water is always going to be our beverage of choice. Some other things to think about, just, again, longer term, trying to maintain a healthy body weight, just focusing on small changes. Oftentimes it's look at little goals. I think sometimes when we're, someone's looking to lose weight, we set really unrealistic goals in our mind. We're sometimes even just looking at, can I try to see if I can work towards losing 5% of my body weight, can really lead to much better health outcomes. And getting moving after your transplant, they will have you up and moving as soon as tolerated. You'll be doing physical therapy, walking around the hospital. Definitely pepper the physical therapist with questions on what you should be doing at home once you get out of the hospital as well. And then longer term to just health issues, whether it's high blood pressure, diabetes, high cholesterol, continuing to work at those and just keeping your levels within range. One thing that's specific to the transplant population, we do really want to be cautious with certain drug nutrient interactions. With a transplant, the main transplant medications that they use, there is an interaction with grapefruit and grapefruit juice, also Seville oranges, and sometimes pomegranate juice. So that's something just to be cautious with, and to really talk with your medical team, your pharmacist, just to see are there any foods and drinks that I need to limit based on my medication. But those are some common ones. And also sometimes we don't think of it, but like grapefruit juice, you will see in small quantities in things like Fresca, Sunny Delight, the Spindrift, like the seltzer water that's got grapefruit juice in it. So just be careful, because sometimes you might get unknowingly get in some grapefruit juice, which might throw off the levels of your medication. Food safety. This is also, more specific to the transplant population. After a transplant, you will be on immunosuppressive or what we call anti-rejection medications, and they do make your body more susceptible to opportunistic infections, including ones that we can get from food. So this is really important. Just making sure, cooking meats to the proper temperature, avoiding raw or undercooked meat, seafood, and eggs. Common examples might be different sushis or ceviche, poke bowls, I can't speak, raw oysters. Just making sure your fruits and vegetables are washed well. I like this, the old adage, keep your hot food hot and cold food cold. And this is something I think a lot of us can be guilty of. You maybe make some chicken for dinner and it's kind of sitting out for I don't know how long, and you go back and kind of take a bite of it. It's been not within that kind of temperature range. So you want to be really careful with that. Also, avoiding buffets and salad bars is a really good idea because you just never know if someone's sneezing on things. How long are you may not know that the temperature controls are great wherever you are. So that's a really important thing. And having pasteurized dairy is a good thing as well. This is something too, in the take-home link, there is a link with food safety that goes over more of those guidelines. Supplements, that's a big one. I think that as a whole, we are definitely moving to a more people really want things that are more natural. And so a lot of times people really want to try different supplements to see if this is something that can keep me healthier. Couple things just to be careful with is overall, the industry with herbal supplements and things like that, it's not very regulated. So you don't necessarily know exactly what you're getting. So this is something just to always proceed with caution. And absolutely, any kind of herbal supplement, vitamins, minerals, they're medicinal. So please make sure before taking anything over the counter that you're clearing it with your doctor or your pharmacist, just to make sure that it's, number one, safe, and also that it's not interacting with something that you're taking, because there can be a supplement that is generally recognized as safe, but it may actually interact with one of the medicines, particularly if you're a transplant, you're on a lot of powerful meds. Some common herbs that can have interactions are things like St. John's wort, echinacea, ginseng, feverfew. So those are some. And the other piece you see a lot of is a lot of herbal supplements can interfere with blood clotting. So that's obviously really important if you're going in for a big surgery. You don't want to be taking a medicine that's thinning your blood too much. So really important to, again, clear any supplements before you take them. Another one I would say is avoiding supplements that have something called creatine in them. This is something that sometimes you would see at like a GNC and some of the protein powders, they may have creatine, and particularly for people that might be, say, on dialysis that are trying to get more protein in, or post-transplant. If you're like, oh, I want to get more protein in, sometimes you may accidentally pick up a supplement that has creatine. And I would try to avoid that because creatine is harder on the kidneys. And even if you've had a kidney transplant or another organ transplant, we want to not overwork our kidneys with something that could cause damage. So I would try to avoid that. And again, just talking with your doctor, your dietitian, your pharmacist about any kind of vitamin and mineral supplements. Sometimes, I think we think, oh my gosh, the more the better, vitamin D is good. Let's take as much vitamin D as possible. But too much can be a bad thing. And again, everybody is different in what they need. So please clear that with your team first. And then again, one other thing, it's not really a supplement, but just use caution if you see products that contain sugar alcohol. Not that you can't use it, but sugar alcohol is something that's used to sweeten products. You see it a lot in some protein bars, some like sugar-free candy. And it's not a bad thing, but it's not absorbed fully by our GI tract. So it can, for a lot of people, cause some GI distress, some diarrhea. So if you do, or maybe if you find this protein bar that has sugar alcohol in it, just to eat a little bit of it first, just to see like how your body tolerates it, because we definitely don't want to have excessive diarrhea, which could lead to dehydration, when we're dealing with the transplant. So just use a little caution there. When we talk about a healthy body weight, this is something that can be a challenge for really all of us. But particularly after your transplant longer term, it can be a challenge because, you know, a couple different things that might be going on. Number one, hopefully long term, you're feeling better. And usually when we feel better, we've got a better appetite, hopefully, which is a good thing. But that you may have less nauseousness, your body's not as in an inflammatory state. So typically that feeling better, you may find that you're eating more things than you used to. Also, if you are taking prednisone, if any of you guys that are on here have ever taken it, one of the big side effects of it, oftentimes people really notice that it increases their appetite. It also tends to store body weight more. A lot of times people tend to gain more weight with it. Thankfully, we are using much less of prednisone than when I first started in transplant. But it's something, just if you are taking it, just again, monitor how you're feeling, making sure you're staying hydrated, and oftentimes limiting those simple sugars can sometimes be helpful with that. Also, just less dietary restrictions. Again, with a functioning organ transplant, you're likely going to have less restrictions that you had coming into the transplant. So where I use the example with kidney disease, you know, someone maybe was limiting ice cream because ice cream being a dairy product wasn't the best thing for them. Where all of a sudden, you know, your phosphorus levels are normal after a transplant, and you know, you were like, oh, maybe I can have that ice cream now. And sometimes when we include things that we didn't used to have, sometimes if we miss them, especially, we might overdo it a little bit. So just having less dietary restrictions, more acceptable choices, may sometimes lead to weight gain. So just again, keeping it all in check. It's all about a balance. So just really trying to get, you know, focus on those healthy foods, includes the things you like in moderation, and staying active are really key long term. Just healthy lifestyle goals. Again, this is something that is everyone's going to be very specific. So these are kind of general goals, but these are some good things to think about. For most people, focusing on fiber can be a really healthy thing for long-term just nutrition, also for weight maintenance, because fiber helps keep us full. So for most people, somewhere between 25 to 35 grams of fiber a day is a great place to try to aim for. Again, I would work with your dietitian just to make sure that's an appropriate goal for you. Good sources of fiber will be things like whole grains, legumes like your beans, vegetables, fruits. I always encourage you to try to choose whole fruits versus the fruit juice, because when you eat an apple, you're also getting the fiber, you're getting the minerals, where when you have apple juice, no fiber and often much more added sugar. So the fruit versus the fruit juice is a really great place to do that. And then again, just watching portion sizes. I think, you know, portion distortion is real. When you look at the size of different, you know, even the plates we use nowadays are probably 40% bigger than they used to be. And, you know, when you have a bigger plate, you have more food on it. That's a study. We typically do that. So watching those portion sizes is key. One of my favorite things to do just in striving for a healthy balance is trying to make half your plate be vegetables, because vegetables generally are going to be lower in sodium, they're full of fiber, healthy nutrients, and they're generally on the lower calorie side. And then kind of balancing out that plate with a little bit of protein, a little bit of starch can be a really good balance. Also try to focus more on the real foods. That's something that, again, I think has changed a lot in the past 40 years. When you go in the grocery store, there's just shelves upon shelves of processed foods, which is nice for convenience. But sometimes when you look at the food labels and you see these ingredient lists that are like this long, and you don't know what half the stuff is, it's just probably not the best for us. So trying to focus much more on real foods, less on those processed foods. And when you are buying some more like kind of ready to eat foods, try to find ones that are of the healthier version. Again, move more. Set a step goal for yourself. I find that sometimes, like if you struggle with getting the exercise in, think of something small. Like it might be, if you're really kind of sedentary, when you're watching a television program, get up and maybe move around during the commercials a little bit. Another thing that can be really helpful, I find, I use an example if you have diabetes, is even after a meal time, just getting up and moving 5 to 10 minutes after you eat. That movement helps kind of burn off some of the food we're eating, so it can really impact those blood sugar levels long term. So that is such a great thing. If you are already moving, see like, hey, can I add a couple more steps in my day? But that definitely can be a great thing. I do find with exercise too, it's certainly about sometimes looking big picture and thinking about what I want to do. And they always say it takes 21 days to create a habit. So if you're not currently exercising, that's something I say, just get in the habit, just set small things and it becomes part of your lifestyle. You can also, I sometimes will find that with exercise, it works to almost make it an appointment, just like you might have a doctor's appointment. Tell yourself, okay, you know, Tuesday and Thursday mornings, I'm going to go for a walk, and kind of pencil it in your calendar, whatever might work for you. But those are just some ideas to think about. When we come to like the food piece, again, those lean proteins, typically after a transplant, longer term, you know, with some of the medications we take for a transplant, they can long-term sometimes affect our lipid levels a little bit. So typically we're going to aim for some of those leaner protein choices. So if you're making burgers at home, or maybe making some turkey tacos, if you're doing any ground beef or turkey, look for the ones that are about 93% lean or higher. That's going to be the higher that number, the leaner it is. If you're buying, say, some steaks, typically, if you see the word loin or round in it, those typically indicate a leaner cut of meat. So that, you know, that can be a good thing. You can take the skin off chicken and turkey. The lighter skin chicken or lighter skin turkey will be a little bit lower in fat as well. Fish, including your fatty fish, can be great. The fish that's found in a fatty fish, such as salmon, is more of those healthy fats. It's more of the omega-3s, which we definitely need more of. So fatty fish can be perfect. And again, those plant-based proteins are excellent. So beans, nuts, tofu. You can do some low-fat dairy, eggs and egg whites. All can be excellent protein choices. And then just trying to limit fried food, again, more for management of lipids. If you're frying at home, you know, use those healthy fats, because things like your monounsaturated fats like olive oil, avocado oil, they're not going to affect our lipid levels in a bad way. If anything, they sometimes can improve our good cholesterol, the HDL. So those are certainly things you could use. But unfortunately, if you're getting chicken from, you know, like a fried chicken place, you know, around in Maryland where we are, like a Royal Farms, they're not, definitely, you're not using olive oil. It's going to be much higher in sodium and much higher in fat. So looking at a healthy balance, again, I mentioned this, just that half plate fruits and vegetables, particularly vegetables, especially if you have diabetes, just because the fruits will have a little bit more sugar in them, is such a great way to think about it. Getting a little bit of protein, a little bit of grains, is just a great way to balance that diet. Trying to drink mainly non-caloric fluids such as water, particularly when we're trying to achieve a healthy weight. It's amazing how many calories we can get from our drinks. That it can add up fast, particularly like with a lot of drinks nowadays, they're in the 20-ounce bottles. You know, sometimes you can get 200, 300 calories in one bottle of soda or juice or sweet tea, which can really add up. So really focus on that water intake. Another key I think I find can be really helpful, not necessarily even for weight loss, but just to kind of see, you know, what you're normally eating, is tracking your intake. Most people underestimate what they eat by about a third. So that can sometimes be, if you're finding that you're struggling with, you know, keeping the weight in check, it's a great tool to use just to see how much am I actually eating, because sometimes we forget the little nibblets we take throughout the day. And just be mindful of beverages. Also the extras, I think sometimes, you know, like, oh, I had chicken and I had rice and I had vegetables, and you kind of negate like, oh, I forgot about the barbecue sauce I put on my chicken. I forgot about the butter I put on my vegetables. Sometimes the condiments, sometimes we forget to keep track of. With the food diary, sometimes people like the old school paper diary. You know, like, there's so many apps if you're technologically inclined. Things like MyFitnessPal and Lose It are great ones, free apps that you can use just to kind of track your intake. They're really nice too, even if you're not looking necessarily at any weight changes, but just if you want to keep a track of it, so that when you have your doctor's visits, if they are asking you like, hey, tell me a little bit about what you've been eating, to see how it might be impacting your blood sugars or whatnot, you've got a nice record of that. Also, I love, again, accountability, using a pedometer or like a Fitbit, an Apple Watch to track those steps, and trying to get somewhere in that 7,000 to 10,000 steps a day is really good for long term. Portion sizes, again, portions have changed so much, and I love this visual, because sometimes, you know, especially if you're eating out, you don't have like a measuring cup to see how much it is. So these are just some kind of visuals to keep in your mind. The one that always gets me is a bagel about the size of a hockey puck, because if you think about that, I'm like, oh my gosh, like one of those bagels, you know, at Panera, they're so much bigger than that. So I think a hockey puck bagel is more like the little mini bagels you can get in the grocery store. The other one that gets me is the potato. About the size of a computer mouse is what a portion of a potato should look like, where a lot of times, particularly at a restaurant, some of those baked potatoes, I feel like they're about the size of your head. So just be mindful, like that's multiple portions of starch when you have one of those big giant potatoes. And I really like, when you think about like tennis balls, to think of like a cup of fruit or a cup of pasta or rice. Sometimes I even just like ball up my fist, and I think that's about a cup. So it's a good way to kind of eyeball portion sizes. And then dried fruit, the portion size is a little smaller, about the size of a golf ball, because when fruit is dried up, the nutrients, including the sugar, are going to be higher because it's just more condensed. So those are just some good portions to kind of think about. Some other ones I like, what is 3 ounces of protein? It's about the size of a deck of cards. So if someone says 3 ounces of chicken, it's about the size, usually about the palm of your hand or that deck of card size. So sometimes some people, depending where you are, you might be limiting protein, or you might be trying to get a little bit more of it. With dairy, about four little dice is about 1 ounce of cheese. 2 tablespoons of salad dressing is about 2 dice. That's a big one. A dressing is something that it can be easy to go overboard with. So that's always a good visual to keep in mind. The other one I like is, if you ever get like some nuts, for example, oftentimes the serving size on a bag of nuts might just say 1 ounce. What is an ounce? Like, I wish they would do it in like quarter cup or tablespoons, which is a little easier to measure, but about the size of a hard-boiled egg is what you think of as about the size of 1 ounce of nuts or hard candy. So just, that's a good visual to keep in your minds. With sodium intake, of course, that's something we want to limit for many of us. In general, a low sodium diet's less than 2,000 milligrams a day. One thing to know, 1 teaspoon of table salt has 2,300 milligrams of sodium. So really trying to not add salt as much as you can, using things like Mrs. Dash, garlic powder. McCormick has a great new line of salt-free seasonings. So really focusing on those. And of course, reading your label. Even if you don't add any salt, there's salt in everything. A couple of tips I like, try to find more food where the sodium number is less than the calorie number. If that sodium number is bigger than the calories, it just tends to be a little more dense in sodium. And then also, if you look at the percentage, something is 20% or higher, that's considered a high sodium food. If it's 5% or less, that's considered low sodium. When you look at the milligrams specifically, if it's 140 or less, that's a low sodium food. I find a lot of times just with sodium, if you normally are eating 3 meals a day, if you can keep it less than 600 milligrams per meal, that's kind of a great goal to aim for. Other tips, just choosing more fresh foods, frozen vegetables, less canned stuff. If you do choose like canned vegetables, look for the ones that say no salt added. If you rinse something off, it gets rid of about 50% of the sodium. Keep in mind, this is a marketing thing that drives me crazy. If you do see things that say low sodium on the label, still look at the back of them, because they are able to put low sodium if it's 30% less than the original. It's not necessarily low in sodium. And when we go out to eat, there's always going to be more salt. Whether you go to McDonald's, if you go to Panera, if you go to Ruth Chris Steakhouse. So trying to eat more at home as much as you can. And if you are going out, look at the menu ahead of time. A lot of times, a lot of chain restaurants have their nutrition information online, so you can try to find a lower sodium option. One more quick quiz. How much sodium do you think is in a Burger King salad with crispy chicken and Italian dressing? You guys are good. Yes, you can see it's the 1,300 milligrams, which is, it's always amazing to me. And where that's what the tricky part with eating out, I find, is that it's sometimes you think like a salad, that sounds like it'll be a healthier option, but actually can still have a lot of sodium between the dressing and the crispiness of the chicken, the cheese they add. So that's where, if you are going to Burger King, look at the nutrition menu ahead of time, check out that sodium content, and you can see how you can just maybe pick a healthier option. And again, it's what we do day in and day out, not one meal that's going to derail us, but I always think it's a great thing just to be as prepared as we can. With potassium, if you do need to limit your potassium, it sometimes can be elevated initially post-transplant due to medications. The tacrolimus, one of the transplant medicines for some people, will if those levels are a little elevated, may cause your potassium to be up. Also, sometimes with kidney disease may need to be limited. So if you do have to limit your potassium, your doctor usually will tell you to limit some high potassium foods such as bananas, tomatoes, potatoes, oranges, and orange juice for some common examples. Also, just again, portion sizes matters with everything. So a low potassium fruit such as strawberries, it's if you're eating 5 of them, that's a low potassium food. If you sat down and ate 25 strawberries, which totally can be done when they're in season, that would be pretty high in potassium. So that's something you just want to be mindful of with portion size too, if you do have to limit potassium. And some people actually need more potassium too. Particularly if you're on a diuretic like Lasix, it can sometimes lose it. So everyone's different. So good to know, how is my potassium? Is this something I need to limit? Phosphorus is another mineral that's often something we have to monitor. It sometimes can be low post-transplant. So your doctor may have you increase your intake of things like dairy products, beans, and nuts. And just honestly, like especially initially post-transplant, trying to get the protein foods in, because your protein foods will have phosphorus in them as well. With kidney disease, particularly pre-transplant, you may need to limit phosphorus because it oftentimes gets elevated. Particularly, I always encourage you focus on limiting what they call the inorganic sources of phosphorus, so the phosphorus that's added to foods. So for example, whole grains, beans, nuts, they have phosphorus in them, but it's a naturally occurring, so we don't absorb as much of it. Where something like Diet Pepsi or some hot dogs often will have phosphoric acid or sodium phosphate added to it. And that's definitely a lot more detrimental. So trying to really limit that added phosphorus is the big key if you need to limit it. And again, magnesium may be low post-transplant. It's harder to get from the diet. You can get it, but it's not absorbed as much. It is, again, similar to phosphorus, dairy products, whole grains, dark leafy greens, nuts, and seeds. But if you're chronically low, they may put you on a magnesium supplement. They kind of balance the cost benefit with that, is because a lot of magnesium supplements may cause some diarrhea. But those are some that are the Mag Pro Plus tend to be a little bit easier in that regard. Diabetes after a transplant, some people that did not have diabetes, you may develop it after a transplant. It's more prevalent in people that are a little overweight or a little bit older. One of the reasons, like for example, in a kidney transplant, is when we get a new kidney, the insulin in our body, due to that improved kidney function, is moving more quickly through the body. So that's why sometimes people that may not have had diabetes, might have been borderline, may see it after a transplant. Also, again, with some of the medicines, you're seeing more of that. Oftentimes, if you are a little bit overweight, losing 5 to 10% of your body weight may be effective at decreasing that insulin resistance and may help keep you off of medications or on lower doses, and getting a few minutes of movement after meals. From a diet perspective, consistent carbohydrate, choosing more of those veggies, less of the less of the like the starchy stuff. And also, if you haven't been seeing an endocrinologist, they're a specialist that deals with diabetes, so they can be a great person to include in your treatment team. Just some healthy eating plans. There's so many different diets you see all the time, just different trendy things that come and go, like the blood type diet and different. But honestly, like for most times, like for more after a transplant, long-term health, two of kind of the big ones that I think are that stand the test of time is just your Mediterranean diet and what's called your DASH diet, and also just small healthy changes. Like look at where you are and just kind of think about what can I do to be a little better for me, and working with your team to really individualize it to your needs. With the Mediterranean diet, if it's not something you've heard about before, it's more plant focused. And this is a big trend we're seeing across the nutrition industry, is we're seeing the benefit of eating more vegetables and more plant-based foods. So what I love about the Mediterranean diet pyramid, the base of it is being physically active and enjoying meals with others. I love that, because I think food should be something about, it should be a good thing. I think sometimes when we hear the word diet, it's like got this negative connotation to it. It's kind of like you need to limit this and limit that, where it's like, no, like let's get some more of the healthy stuff and enjoy it with our friends and family. So that's a great thing. Getting that movement in, and just really focusing on plenty of fresh fruits and vegetables. Then definitely getting some of the proteins from those plant-based sources. So your nuts, your beans, using more of the herbs and spices to flavor the food. Olive oil is a super healthy fat that's a big part of the Mediterranean diet. So that's where we get a lot of our fat calories from. And then adding in, you need some, for the protein, fish and seafood. And then using, having your chicken, your eggs, cheese and yogurt, a little bit of that. And then the top part of the pyramid would be things like meat, sweets. Doesn't mean you can't ever have it, but that doesn't necessarily want to be the basis of your diet. So that's a little bit about the Mediterranean diet, but that's a really good kind of long-term health diet plan, if you will, or way to eat. I wouldn't even call it a diet plan. And then the DASH diet, it just stands for Dietary Approach to Stop Hypertension. So it's a low sodium diet. It does tend to be a little higher in potassium. So if you do need to limit your potassium after your transplant, just with your fruit and vegetable choices, I would try to choose those lower potassium fruits and vegetables since you are eating more of them, just to kind of keep those lines in check. And this is just the NHLBI. This is one of the NIH websites, just has more information on the DASH diet, but it can be a good solid plan. It's a little bit more lower in fat, where the Mediterranean diet will be higher in fat, but the specific healthy types of fat, the olive oil, avocado oil, and things like that. Both can be great. It's just really what you feel more comfortable with. Some resources that I'm hopeful will be helpful. First, I cannot stress this enough, utilize your registered dietitian that you have available through your transplant center, both before and after your transplant. They're just a really good resource for you that knows your labs and knows where you are. You can look up a lot of stuff on the internet, and there's a lot of good stuff out there, but it sometimes can be more general and not specific to what you're dealing with. There's a link for food safety. That's a great one if you're curious about some food safety guidelines. A couple of good websites. I love the American Heart Association as well as the National Kidney Foundation. Both have great information on their websites, and they do have tabs with a lot of recipes on them as well if you're looking for some recipes to try. Some other resources, chair exercises. This can be great for someone that maybe you're trying to get more moving, but maybe you got real short of breath with walking, or you just don't have the energy to move around as much. There's a lot of great chair exercises you can do to build strength. So that link is it's a Silver Sneakers website that I found that has some nice, easy chair exercises that you could do. And I had mentioned earlier about just my love for embracing that mental health and mental exercise as well. Two apps that I absolutely adore, the Calm app and the Headspace are both really good apps for guided meditation. I know, like on the Calm app, they have what's called a daily calm. It's just like a little 10-minute calming thing. They have a new one every day. They also have, if you have trouble sleeping, they have great like sleep stories. So they can be awesome. And there's a lot of free stuff as well. But just sometimes a 5-minute or 10-minute meditation can be really good for just kind of calming you down and can help with blood pressure management and just mindfulness in general. Checking with local hospitals or a transplant program as far as a physical therapy referral if you're feeling really deconditioned and you need to build that strength up can be excellent. And then there's just a really neat little link I found for kind of a beginner's guide to walking plan. So if you're hoping to get more into walking, some of those numbers I talked about earlier about how to increase it, they're in that link. They're really just a good, easy way to kind of increase that exercise. So just in review, when we think of post-transplant, I sometimes in my mind go to like a heart healthy diet, because after a transplant, hopefully our new organ is working. And so we're really looking towards long-term health, which usually is more of like a heart healthy diet. Your healthy fats, lots of fruits and vegetables, really just a good balance. We're trying to aim for a healthy weight, staying active. Of course, specific to transplant, focus on food safety, avoiding foods that interact with the medications we're on, drinking our water, and key, communicating with your healthcare team so you can know what's best for you is so important. But thank you guys so much for joining today. We have, I think, a couple minutes for questions. I also put my email up there. It's christinehare@gmail.com. So if you do have follow-up questions after the seminars today, please feel free. You can always email me, and I'm happy to hopefully answer any questions you have. I know we have a couple minutes for questions before the next session starts. So I wanted to open that up and see, Teresa, if there's any questions at all.
Sure. Thank you, Christine. This was all very helpful. We have a couple of questions. Feel free to add any more. We have about 8 minutes or so, 10 minutes left of our session. The first one said that they were surprised to see an advertisement for medical marijuana. Previous session showed not to use with tacrolimus. Are there reasons to use or not use with a heart transplant?
That is a really good question. And I will tell you, that is not something that would be my expertise from as a dietitian perspective. From what I do know, like, so tacrolimus is a really common transplant medicine that's used in most organ types. So that's something that I would say would be really specific. I know there have been some studies showing that with medical marijuana that it does not affect, affect the different, they don't see a huge effect, but it's certainly something like, even like that advertisement showed, it's not been studied a lot. So that would be certainly something I would talk about with your team before venturing into that. But I know it's not necessarily contraindicated, but again, I would talk with your actual team about that.
Okay. There are apps that track calories. Are there any that track calories and sodium?
Great question. So yes and no. Sometimes you have to buy the paid versions of the apps that have the sodium in there. Though I will tell you that I myself, I love the Lose It app. I just use the free version, and the sodium is in for a lot of the foods. So you can actually kind of look at your sodium. You would have to go in and see, like, it doesn't track it with the free version, where you can, you'd have to see like the sodium. It doesn't show at the end of the day, but if the paid version does have the sodium in there. I'm not sure about MyFitnessPal if it'll track the sodium. I think that's more calories as well, but it is in there. It just it's not as easily trackable with the free versions.
Okay. Do you have a resource or website that has a more complete list of food and drug interactions for post-transplant patients?
So they're really specific. There's not a website that I can think of off the top of my head as far as just drug interactions, because everyone's going to be on different medicines. The big ones for transplant, it's with the tacrolimus and it's the old school medicine cyclosporin with that. So it's really like the big ones were grapefruit juice, Seville oranges, pomegranate juice. The studies are kind of, they're mixed. I usually would tell people just to be careful with it, just to be on the safe side. But those would be with the transplant medicines. Those were your main drug interactions. Now, a lot of people are not just on those medicines, obviously. So there are other medicines that you might, that you're taking. What I would recommend is, honestly, if you have a pharmacist, wherever you fill your medicines, talk with your pharmacist and be like, hey, with the list of medicines I'm on, what are my interactions? Because sometimes when you look like with the websites, it can be, there's all sorts of different stuff. But if you go to your pharmacist, they can usually say like, hey, this with what you are taking, this is what you don't want to have. With the herbal stuff, there's not like a huge, great database. Those ones I mentioned were some common ones that do interact. I don't know of like a big website. That's again something I would say check with maybe your pharmacist testing.
Can I eat eggs if they're well cooked?
Yes, eggs cooked are fine.
I am one of the individuals who is diabetic and never used meds before transplant, but now having to adjust to taking insulin 4 times a day, it's frustrated and hard to stick to myself. Any suggestions?
That is a huge adjustment. I totally agree, Kevin. When you weren't diabetic and you get your transplant and you're so pumped for it, and then all of a sudden you're kind of confronted with this, it's a big challenge. I don't know how soon you are post-operatively. Sometimes the longer you get out, you may find that it gets better. What I would suggest is, if you're not already, maybe seeing an endocrinologist if you haven't already been set up with one. Sometimes, I know initially, a lot of times when people are diagnosed with diabetes, they have you, sticking yourself and taking what we call sliding scale insulin to kind of, if your sugar is high, here, take some insulin to bring it down. Where longer term, that's not always the best way to manage it. It might be where they might, depending on how your numbers are, sometimes they can adjust you to where you're taking maybe like a long-term insulin once a day, or maybe twice a day versus 4 times a day. So there's definitely some options. The other things I would say, again, if it's something that you may be dealing with longer, and depending on how much insulin you're taking, there are options such as like an insulin pump or like a continuous glucose monitor, so you're not necessarily sticking yourself all the time. So those would be things to talk about with your team, just if it may make it easier for you to deal with. And if you haven't seen an endocrinologist or like a diabetes educator, they can be really great, helpful sometimes in just managing the diabetes to make it easier to deal with.
I've had my transplant 4 months now. I've lost about 40 pounds. Curious to know more about diet. I'm not aware of what meds or foods interact with.
Well, that's awesome. Congrats on the transplant. I don't know if the 40-pound weight loss is a positive thing for you or if that's a negative thing for you. That can go either way. With the diet, again, biggest thing I would say is, through your transplant team, wherever you had your transplant, see if you can set up a meeting with a dietitian. That's something you absolutely can do, even after your transplant, just to make sure that you're on the right track and that you're, to make sure you're on the right track with everything. The biggest thing, what the meds, again, I mentioned, I would stay away from grapefruit juice. And if you're, I know you're with the new diabetes, that would be the biggest thing. I think making sure you know how to eat for your new diabetes diagnosis. So that's where meeting with a dietitian through the transplant team or through an endocrinologist office would probably be a really, really great thing.
I'm diabetic and 9 years on for a heart transplant. I'm wearing a Dexcom and notice after taking the Novolog, eating 15 minutes after, and taking my anti-rejection drugs, Pred, Myforic, and Prograf. Instant wingo bingo, the blood sugars go rolling up the scale, quickly climbing from 85 to 250. Pretty distressing. Portions are small and in keeping with what I should eat. So is it the meds?
Yeah. Yes, Gwen. The meds probably have a big role in that. So the other thing you'll see too is, I don't know so if you're taking your Novolog, and then anytime when we eat, like if you're seeing your sugars, like even just after we eat 15 minutes, even after eating healthy food and not big portions, it's normal for your sugars to go up. That's what happens. It's that postprandial response, but definitely not the Myforic as much, but Prednisone and Prograf definitely can have impact on the blood sugars where you might see that. Try not to get distressed. I know I love the Dexcom because it shows you that real-time response. So it can really help with management of sugars, but sometimes it is a little, you're like, oh my gosh, like I ate the healthiest meal. Why is my sugar going up? The meds are playing a role. The biggest thing I would look at, big picture with it, is how is your A1C level? Find out, with your team. I know typically they say if you can keep your A1C under about 7%, that's a big goal for a lot of people. Everyone is different, so your goal may be a little bit different than that. But talking with your doctor to find where you are, and if your A1C is pretty well controlled, even if you're seeing those little bumps, it's that big picture control we're looking at. If you're finding that your A1C is elevated and they do think it might be the medicines, again, working with your diabetes team, if your A1C is 6.4, that's excellent. That's really excellent. So that little bump that you're seeing, overall, it's controlling it. So that's what I would look. The Dexcom is awesome, but sometimes it can get in your head a little bit. But if your A1C is 6.4, I would imagine your doctors are pretty happy with that.
DNA testing for diet is advertised in media a lot. Is there any validity to it?
That's something I haven't looked a lot into, but truly, I guess that's something that I don't have paying a lot of money for a DNA test to tell you what diet's best for you is not something I really probably have a lot of faith in. There's certain things, sure, like if your DNA test might show you have a more prone to certain disease types, but that's not something, again, I know a ton about, and I probably wouldn't waste my money on it unless it was really, really, really cheap to see just what it would show. And then I saw the question from Scott too about the minimum. Great question. Yeah, we need sodium. We all do. Everyone is different. I would say a minimum for most people is going to be around like at least 1,000 a day. Again, everyone's slightly different in that regard, but you do need some sodium. For most people, a good range, somewhere between 1,500 to 2,000. After transplant, you may even be able to have a little bit more than that. But it's, if you're getting 500 milligrams of sodium a day, that's not necessarily a good thing either. So usually a minimum, I would say closely about 1,000.
And our last question, I didn't hear you mention body mass index. Has BMI fallen out of favor?
Great question. So yes and no. I think so. Body mass index, it's still definitely utilized, and actually in transplant, it's used still quite a bit. What you do see is that with a lot of times, many transplant centers still, particularly pre-transplant, they often will have people say, with transplant, some centers, for example, for a kidney transplant might say you have to have a BMI of less than 35 or less than 40. So it's definitely still utilized. I find that it is kind of falling out of favor a little bit in the big nutrition, just because it's not, BMI, it's a tool. It's your height and your weight essentially, but it's not taking into account your muscle mass. It's not taking into account how you carry your weight. I just an example, I had a patient years ago who was getting a kidney transplant. They used to play professional football. So his body mass index was 42, which is technically what they would call morbidly obese. But if you saw this guy in person, he was all muscle. He was a former football player. Like, you would never call him obese. He was just a really big bodied man full of muscle. So it's definitely not a perfect measurement. Do I think it's good to know your BMI? Yeah, it's good to monitor overall trends is the big thing I look for. But the big thing I would focus on really is just, is finding a weight you're comfortable with, eating healthy. I sometimes am more like, weight is a part of the equation, but really just focusing on those healthy lifestyles is a big picture thing.
Thank you again, Christine, for your time and your insights. We appreciate that.
Absolutely.
I know there were a few questions that we couldn't get to, and I apologize, but I know that Christine has given you her email link if you want to contact her directly. Our next session will begin at 11:45, and please remember to check the event website or your email for the Zoom link for your next session. Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.